Last time, we stood in the ash of two buried Roman towns and found, sealed inside them, the only library the ancient world ever left us whole. Around 1,800 scrolls, charred black by a volcano, kept safe for 2,000 years by the very disaster that destroyed them. A library saved by catastrophe. Now hold that thought and turn it completely around. Because there was another library, the most famous the world ever built. And where that little collection at Herculaneum was preserved by a single violent afternoon, this one vanished with no catastrophe at all. You already know its name, the Library of Alexandria. And you think you know its story. Picture the night sky over the harbor glowing orange, scrolls curling into ash, a universe of ancient knowledge going up in a single night of flame, and with it, so the legend goes, 1,000 years of human progress. And it is almost entirely wrong. The greatest library ever built did not burn down in a single night. It was neglected to death, slowly, over 4 centuries. And that is far more frightening than fire, because great knowledge usually dies not in a blaze, but in a slow starving of funding and attention. There was no single fire and no single villain, only time and forgetting. This is the story of what we really lost.
To feel the loss, you first have to see how high it once stood. It began around 295 years before the Common Era, in a gleaming new city on the Egyptian coast, Alexandria, founded by Alexander the Great and ruled after him by a line of Greek kings, the Ptolemies. An exiled Athenian named Demetrius of Phalerum is said to have first put the idea to Ptolemy I. His son, Ptolemy II, built it into something the world had never seen. And here is what most people miss. The library was never just a room full of scrolls. It was the heart of a greater institution called the Mouseion, the Temple of the Muses, which is the very word that became our museum. It was, in effect, the first great research institute on Earth. The kings gathered the finest scholars of the age and gave them one astonishing gift: a life free of every other duty, rent-free, tax-free, fed and paid by the crown, for one purpose alone: to think. And the ambition behind it was breathtaking. The goal, quite literally, was to collect a copy of every book in the world, to gather all of human knowledge under a single roof for the very first time in history. This was not just a building. It was a dream made of papyrus and gold.
So how large did it actually grow? Here, an honest storyteller has to slow down. You will hear staggering figures that the library held 400,000 scrolls, even 700,000. Other sources say 40,000. And the truth is, we cannot trust any of them. Every one comes from an ancient writer working without a shelf count, often long after the fact. The modern classicist Roger Bagnall put it bluntly: the biggest figures probably reflect what we want to believe, not what a workshop of scribes copying by hand could ever have produced. So let us be careful. Ancient writers claimed tens of thousands of scrolls, perhaps hundreds of thousands, and we have no reliable way to check. The exact number is not the point. The point is that this was, by a wide margin, the largest gathering of the written word anywhere in the ancient world. There was even a second collection across the city inside a temple called the Serapeum, the so-called daughter library. One ancient source puts it at around 42,000 scrolls, copies of the main collection. Another figure we should hold loosely. But remember that temple and its name. It will matter a great deal, several centuries from now, when the villains begin to gather. Now, when do you imagine the library began to die? Almost everyone reaches for a fire. But the first true wound had nothing to do with flame, and it came far earlier than anyone expects. Remember how it worked. It lived on royal money and royal favor, which made it magnificent
and made it fragile. The moment the king stopped caring, nothing else held it up. And that moment arrived around 145 years before the Common Era. Egypt fell into a savage dynastic war, and a king remembered as Ptolemy VIII turned on the scholars of Alexandria, purging them, driving them out of the city. Among those swept away was the head librarian, a man named Aristarchus of Samothrace. And here is the quiet, chilling detail. He is the last chief librarian whose name we have on record. After him, the roll of girl librarians simply goes dark. Sit with what that means. Long before Caesar, long before any famous fire, the lamp had already begun to dim. The scholars had scattered. The royal money was drying up. And as Egypt itself weakened and finally fell to Rome, the lifeblood that had fed the library quietly drained away. This is the turning point the legends never mention. A slow, ordinary looking away, with no flames and no villain at all.
And now we reach the fire everyone remembers, the one with a famous name attached to it, Julius Caesar. In the year 48 before the Common Era, Caesar was trapped in the middle of an Egyptian civil war, besieged inside Alexandria itself. To save his own fleet, he set fire to the enemy's ships in the harbor, and the flames, carried by the wind, spread from the water to the buildings along the docks. Ancient writers made the most of it. Seneca, quoting an older historian, claimed that 40,000 scrolls burned. Plutarch wrote flatly that the fire consumed the great library. And for 2,000 years, that has been the headline. Caesar burned the Library of Alexandria. But look closer, and it comes apart. What stood at the water's edge were warehouses, storerooms holding manuscripts waiting to be shipped abroad. Scholars such as Luciano Canfora argue that Caesar's fire burned the loading dock, not the library. And we have proof, because the library went on working for decades afterward. Around 20 years before the Common Era, nearly 30 years after the fire, the geographer Strabo came to Alexandria, walked through the Mouseion, and described it as thriving, without a single word about any great burning. A real fire? Yes. The loss of some scrolls? Almost certainly. But the fire that ended the Library of Alexandria? No. That part is a story we have told ourselves.
So if not Caesar, then who? Follow the trail forward more than 3 centuries into a Roman civil war that almost no one remembers today. By the 270s of the Common Era, Alexandria had been seized by the armies of a rebel queen named Zenobia. To win it back, the Emperor Aurelian brought his legions down on the city, and the fighting gutted the Mouseion, the royal palace quarter, the very district where the great library had stood. One ancient writer says the whole quarter was left almost a desert. A generation later, around 297, the Emperor Diocletian besieged Alexandria once more and wrecked that same quarter again. If anything of the great library still stood by then, this is most likely where it finally perished. But notice that small, stubborn word, if. Because by the 3rd century, 400 years past its golden age, the library may already have dwindled to almost nothing. Aurelian soldiers may have fought their way through a neighborhood whose greatest treasure was already a memory. Do you see the pattern? Each time we look for the moment of destruction, we find a real disaster and an empty room. Another wound, but not on its own. The ending either. The trail now leads to the 3rd suspect, and here we must move carefully and fairly. Remember that second collection, the daughter library, kept inside the temple called the Serapeum? By the 4th century, the Roman world had changed profoundly. In the year 391, the Emperor Theodosius issued a decree ordering the old temples closed. And in Alexandria, the Bishop Theophilus led the destruction of the Serapeum. That much is well recorded. But here is what the dramatic versions leave out. It is simply unknown whether the Serapeum still held any real collection of books by then. Scholars point out there was no great library left in Alexandria to burn by then. What came down was a temple, perhaps long emptied of its scrolls, perhaps never holding very many. A late partial chapter, not the burning of the Library of Alexandria. And while we are here, one more myth to set right. You may have heard of Hypatia, the brilliant mathematician murdered in Alexandria a few decades later, and seen her death tied to the library's fall, most famously in a modern film. It is also a confusion. Hypatia was not the last librarian, and her murder was not the library's end. Two separate tragedies, wrongly braided into one.
Which brings us to the fourth and final suspect, and the most vivid story of them all. When Arab armies took Alexandria in the 7th century, a tale grew up around the conquest. It is said that the Caliph Omar ordered the library's scrolls burned as fuel for the city's public baths. A whole library, so the story goes, fed to the furnaces over 6 long months. It is a haunting image. It is also a fabrication. That tale appears nowhere until roughly the 12th and 13th centuries, some 600 years after the event it claims to describe. No one who lived through the conquest ever mentions it. The historian Edward Gibbon dismissed it as invention more than 200 years ago. And the plainest problem of all? There was no great library left to burn. It had been gone for centuries before those armies ever arrived. Now, look at the whole lineup together. Caesar, a Roman emperor's soldiers, a Christian bishop, a Muslim caliph. Notice what every age has done. It reached for a villain, very often one it already feared or disliked, to explain a loss that had no single culprit at all. The question we keep asking, who burned the Library of Alexandria, turns out to be the wrong question entirely. So here is the honest answer. The legends never offer. The Library of Alexandria was not murdered in a night. It slowly demised. The phrase belongs to a modern curator. Through lost patronage, scattered scholars, and plain neglect over 400 or 500 years. There is no single date to mark, no ruin left standing, no way to say for certain when or how it ended. And that uncertainty is part of what was lost. So what did we lose? We cannot list it. No catalogue of those shelves survives. And the popular claim that Alexandria's fall set humanity back 1,000 years is itself a myth. Most of that knowledge was never unique to Alexandria and lived on by being copied elsewhere, in Constantinople, in Baghdad, in quiet monasteries. What we truly lost cannot be counted in scrolls. We lost the gathered learning of a whole civilization and the dream of holding all of it in one place. But that dream did not burn. It outlived every fire, wheel, and invented. Today, on that same shore at Alexandria, a great modern library stands again, reopened in the year 2002, still reaching for that ancient, stubborn dream. And that is the lesson worth carrying away from all of this. Great knowledge rarely dies in a blaze with a villain to blame. It dies quietly, from lost funding, scattered minds, and a world that simply stops paying attention. Next time, on Myths in History, another story that history got wrong. But that is a tale for another day. The codex closes until the next story is ready.